So we've all been in the situation where we wake up fairly early in the morning and tell ourselves, today is the day I'm finally going to start working. And so we get to the table, and to our surprise, we feel fairly motivated. 20 minutes pass, 40 minutes pass, and then you just kind of look over to your side and you see your phone. Oh, I've just got a notification, someone's just messaged me. And you think to yourself, should I have a peek? Should I not have a peek? There's probably no harm in it, so you pick up the phone and you have a look. And a peek turns into a scroll turns into a conversation, and by the end of that you find yourself on your bed watching Netflix series for the rest of the day, not having done the thing that you set out to do. This is unfortunately a situation we're all too familiar with, where we say we're going to complete a specific task with firm belief that it will happen, only to find that without realizing we've already lost the battle before even starting. And I'm not going to sit here and say, that I've never fallen into this, but I've also experienced the opposite. And let me tell you a bit about that. So we're going back to my second year at university. I decided to study biomedical science because I didn't get into medical school the first time. And I had this opportunity. Get the necessary grades during those second year exams, and I would have the opportunity to get into medical school. I would be offered one of 20 places who about 200 people were competing for. So let me paint you the picture. I was told by some of the older students that I was about to have some of the hardest exams within the biomedical science course. It was also July, so it was hot to say the least. It was also Ramadan, so I was fasting from sunrise to sunset with no food and water within the daylight hours. And in terms of work, I had 110 lectures to memorize, 15 essays to write that could potentially come up and also memorize. And so I had to do something. And what I did kind of even shocked myself, to be honest. During those 4 weeks of exam revision, I entered into a total, absolute state of immersion into the work I was doing. I was working from about 5 p.m. to around 11 a.m. and sleep after that. I would usually only take breaks to eat or to drink or for the odd YouTube video, really. And my phone was the least of my concerns. The number of times I check my phone in a given day, I can count in one hand. And in fact, I've entered into this type of immersive state a few times. One is when I'm editing these types of videos where I can sit down for about 10 hours just editing straight. But also just recently, about 5 weeks ago, where I was studying for my final medical school exams. And I was studying for a combined 8 to 10 hours a day. And by the way, this is for someone who, before starting university, couldn't even sit down for 20 minutes just to do some work in high school. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily the healthiest way of working, but what I want to touch on is the underlying principle. What is it that allows people to go into this intense mode of focus and concentration on the task at hand? And the answer to that is something called the concept of flow. It's the same state that allows athletes to break world records, artists to just sit down for tens of hours in painting, sometimes forgetting to eat, footballers to score the most craziest goals, and in this case, students working for hours on end with absolute concentration. In the 1960s, there was this guy, and his name was Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he wanted to look into this phenomenon. So he went out and interviewed artists, musicians, sports people, and he asked them when was the times where they would experience this optimal performance. And so he went on to define flow as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else matters. The experience is so enjoyable that people will continue to do it even at a great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. And this is honestly exactly what I experienced during those moments I described earlier. It had nothing to do with watching motivational videos on YouTube just to kind of give me a temporary boost, or posting on social media to tell everybody that now I'm finally going to start working. It all had to do with this state of flow. Okay, so it's all well and good saying that you need to be in the state of flow, but how do you actually enter into flow? There isn't really a hard and fast rule, but there are some things that used to help me to get into the state. And in fact, these are some things that I used to do even before I knew that this is something called flow. And I'll tell you the tips that coincide with what Mihai said so that it has some evidence base and I'm not just sitting here waffling. So let's go over 4 specific tips to induce flow. And the first one is that Mihai found through his research that an important component of flow is clarity of goal. And what I found in terms of studying is that there needs to be a very clear goal in the micro and in the macro. In the micro, you need to know exactly what you want to achieve out of a specific session. What exactly is the point of you sitting on that table on that day? What do you want out of it? Sitting there and just reading or carelessly looking through notes or doing questions without a specific aim just doesn't cut it. And also the other thing is that you'll be more gullible to really simple distractions. So let me give you an example. If you're running a marathon, it's far easier to cover the distance if you know exactly what distance you're running. Is it a 5K run or a 10K run or a 15K run? Whereas if you're running and you don't know when the finish line will appear, you don't know if it's a 5K run or it could be that the finish line will appear in the next 10 minutes, then you're more likely to stop. And that is the same example as someone who sits and studies without a specific aim for that session. And also in the macro, there needs to be some very specific goals also. What are you trying to achieve in the next few weeks or in the next few months or in the years? What is the overall purpose of you doing this work? And that's something I used to set as well. For example, the overarching goal could be that in these exams that I'm studying for, I want to get 80%. And the reason why I want to get 80% is because I want to get this prize, or I want to get into med school, or I want to get into this PhD, or I want to, whatever it is, there needs to be some type of overarching goal as well that is very specific. And so we move on to point number 2, and it's that the goal needs to be challenging enough. And actually the task needs to be quite challenging too. And what Mihai found was that there was an interesting relationship between the level of challenge and the level of skill. So for example, if the challenge is really low and the skills are really high, then you'll find yourself getting bored because the task is just too easy for your skills. Whereas on the other hand, if the challenge is really high, but the skills are very low, then you find yourself very anxious because the task is just a bit too difficult and you can't meet it through your skills. And so a person enters into flow when the task is challenging enough for the skill set that a person has. And what you find then is that you enter into this kind of positive feedback loop where as the challenge increases, the skills increase. And as the skills increase, you need a higher challenge. And because you get a higher challenge, your skills increase. And that's exactly what flow is. And so obviously when you're studying, you can't really modify how difficult the content is. The content and the curriculum is already set. And the way I'd modify that is by changing how difficult the goal I was setting was for myself, both in the micro and in the macro. So in the macro, I would set the overarching goal. So for example, a percentage or a specific rank that I want to achieve in my year group. And it would be so difficult that I would think it's likely that I won't get it, but it's possible that I might be getting it. And also in the micro, I would set a specific number of questions to get through within the hour session that I had. So in the hour, I want to get through 25, 30, 35 questions, and that would kind of be the target I'd be working towards. So let's move on to the third point, and that is that distraction is the enemy of flow. You can think of flow as like water flowing through a hose pipe. So if I put my foot on a hose pipe and I block it, the water will stop flowing. And such is distraction to a person staying and entering into the state of flow. And that is a good explanation for why it's so useful to keep your phone away from you as far as possible when you're working. Keep that phone like 2 meters away, social distancing from your phone, you get what I'm saying? Yeah, social distance from your phone, or keep the phone in a different room, so self-isolation from the room. Okay, I need to stop this. Or keep the phone in a separate room, that might be useful too. It's just key to eliminate distraction to maintain flow. And now finally to the fourth point. And it's that inducing flow isn't really an easy task. It's not something that is done in a few minutes. Okay, now I'm gonna enter into the state of flow, and you sit down and there you go, you're all flowing and stuff. That's just not how it works. I've always found that I've always needed to build up and build myself into the state of flow. Initially, you know what? You'll feel a huge amount of resistance, and that's what I also felt. But when you do it day in, day out, at least for a few days, then it becomes much easier to maintain that traction. And let me give you a different analogy. So say I'm about to cycle, or I'm cycling on a flat surface or a flat road, and I'm initiating from kind of a standstill. Initially, I'll feel a huge amount of resistance when I start pedaling, right? When you're just kind of going from 0 to 5 miles per hour, there will be a huge amount of resistance when you're pressing the pedal. But then when you've built up to that, maybe 20 miles per hour or 15 miles per hour, then you don't need to put in as much energy to maintain that very same speed. Whereas if, for example, someone crosses the road and you're having to stop the bike, then you'll need to put in a lot more energy to go back into that same speed that you initially maintained. And I feel like this example perfectly describes exactly what flow is. It's difficult to get into it. It's easy to maintain. If you stop and start, then it's just not gonna work. And that is the end of the video. I hope you found those tips useful. And honestly, this is exactly what it's all been about for me anyway in the last 6 years, learning about how I'm studying and how I motivate myself. And it's never really been about kind of getting loads of external motivation. It's been intrinsic. Yeah, I hope it was useful. And yeah, thank you for watching. Safe.